Welcome to the Classical Gabfest, a weekly discussion about the ever-changing world of classical music. I'm your host for this week, William White, and with me as always are Tiffany Liu and Kensho Watanabe. This week we'll start off with a roundup of news topics, then we'll discuss Carnegie Hall's new logo, and finally we'll do a deep dive into the music of Sir Malcolm Arnold, in honor of the composer's 100th anniversary. But first we'd like to start off with our prelude segment. So, Kensho, what do we have today?
Today we'll be playing a round of everyone's favorite game, Game of Pairs. Alright, here's how this game is played. I've chosen two composers who share a similar musical style, and I'm going to play three selections that my co-hosts will listen to and try to guess who wrote each one of them. And of course, we encourage you to play along at home. This week's composers are Gabriel Fauré and Camille Saint-Saëns. But before we get into the game, let's briefly discuss what makes these composers' styles similar and different.
Well, I would never have thought of these two composers as sharing a similar style. I mean, they have similar biographical details in that they're both French composers, mainly active in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. What's interesting is that Saint-Saëns is the senior of the two. I mean, he was born in like the 1830s or something, and yet his style is much more the conservative voice. I mean, he's like a Mendelssohnian composer, whereas Fauré is like sort of the granddaddy of the Impressionist movement. Tiff, what do you think of this?
Well, without being able to supply any of the biographical details that Will is able to, I will say that I do think of Saint-Saëns as the more populist of the two composers. I mean, you say conservative. For me, it's like, okay, the works that we associate with Saint-Saëns is like, well, the poor guy, he hated that Carnival of the Animals was his claim to fame, but there you are. And, his piano concerti, I don't know what else, organ symphony, obviously. So, quite a conservative or populist harmonic language, whereas Fauré was more adventurous harmonically, but also I think of him as also like kind of pared back orchestrationally.
The reason why I picked these two composers, one, because it's interesting. I'm always about like these family trees of composers. Just like Fauré studied with Saint-Saëns, and their birth years are only 10 years apart. So it's not like they're completely of different time periods, right? And the other thing is that when we think about French music, we've talked so much about Debussy and Ravel and like the Impressionists, but not necessarily it feels bad to say the other composers, but the other French composers that are kind of overlooked. And then when I started looking into this, I found that they both wrote a lot of cello music. So all three excerpts that you will hear today are going to be cello and piano.
C'est très intéressant. Okay.
All right, you guys ready?
Yeah.
And here is excerpt number 1.
That was, how do I even describe the back and forth that I just underwent? I mean, I started with Fauré, then I was totally convinced it was Saint-Saëns, then I was back to Fauré by the end, and now I'm flummoxed. I don't know. It was a faint left and right and center at the same time. Tiff, did you have any more clarity on that than I did?
I think I'm gonna be more comfortable going with Fauré for this one. I don't know. I mean, let's try and describe what we're hearing here. You called Fauré the granddaddy of the Impressionist movement, and I heard inklings of that in the piano harmonies that were being given there, which is not to say that Saint-Saëns would not be capable of writing this, but it seems to have this mellower kind of introspective feel that I associate a little bit more with Fauré as well.
The time at which I thought it might be Saint-Saëns was, so there was these chords at the introduction, at the very beginning, and then it went into a little bit of an Orientalist mood, and that I think of as being more Saint-Saëns. So that's when I went the Saint-Saëns route. But then at the end, yeah, it was those arpeggios in the piano and that sort of lilting melody that took me back to Fauré. So I'm going to go with you. I think I'm going to say this is Fauré.
That is correct. This is Fauré's Romance for Cello and Piano, Opus 69.
Pretty.
All right, excerpt number 2.
This one I would say is Saint-Saëns.
I would feel pretty comfortable with that, yes.
I mean, the octaves at the beginning, then the sort of classical textures, the scales running up and down.
Yeah, you mentioned Mendelssohn in conjunction with Saint-Saëns earlier, and this reminded me of, like if you were to take Mendelssohn and extend him more into the Romantic era, just kind of the clarity of the two instruments playing off of one another and handing off phrases. It just has a very classical structure to it, and it's kind of dramatic in the same way that I associate with Saint-Saëns.
Yeah, this is exactly right. This is Saint-Saëns' first cello sonata in C minor, opus 32, the first movement. All right, so we've had one Saint-Saëns, one Fauré, so the third one's up in the air. Here we go.
I would be awfully surprised if this was Saint-Saëns, but this could be a real feint here. I don't know. That seemed pretty modern in terms of texture and harmony and virtuosity.
Yeah, I think texture is the operative word here, because while it's not inconceivable that Saint-Saëns would write something that kind of had this harmonic language, maybe, like the kind of flurry of notes and then the alighting of phrases all suggest to me a slightly more avant-garde approach, to just contrast that against what we just said about excerpt number 2, where there's sort of a classical clarity about the texture. I would also be fairly surprised if this were Saint-Saëns.
Yeah, I'm going to go with the obvious here. I'm going to say this is Fauré.
Damn, I was going to try to play mind games with you this week, but you guys were not fooled. This is the second cello sonata by Fauré. Do you guys know these cello sonatas by Fauré?
Not at all. And
Afraid
in particular, the first one, I mean, of course we were both sort of piqued when you announced this pairing of composers, but that first one really is possible,
Yeah. And you guys centered on one thing that I think I wanted to kind of illustrate through these 3 excerpts is this kind of, there is still a little bit of that like classical like blockiness to Saint-Saëns' writing. And in both, especially in the third excerpt or the second Fauré excerpt, those lines are completely gone, right? It's just all blurred in some ways. And then in the first one, where I think it got tripped up was that there were still elements of that kind of like phrase, beginning, start, structure was there, right? And I think that's maybe perhaps, and then also the kind of running notes in the accompaniment figure, like in the piano, that also help kind of blur those lines.
Yeah, and it's not that you don't have running notes in, say, that last excerpt, but it's like they're so blended and intertwining and simultaneous often between the two hands that you don't get the same clarity as you sometimes have. And that, to not just dump on Saint-Saëns here, that clarity is often what gives Saint-Saëns his compelling melodies as well, because like let's talk about Danse Macabre, let's talk about Carnival of the Animals, let's talk about the second piano concerto, like the, I'll say, predictability of the phrases combined with the classical clarity of them is what makes Saint-Saëns an enduring composer.
That just about does it for this week's Prelude segment, but before we wrap up, we'd like to remind our listeners that we do periodic listener-generated Name That Tune rounds, so we invite you to try and stump us. check our show notes, where you'll find a link to the forum where you can upload a 30-second clip of an unidentified piece of classical music for us to try to identify. And with that, we move on to our first topic. Tiffany, what do you have for us?
Every week at the GabFest, we try to keep our listeners apprised of the major news and goings-on in the world of classical music, but sometimes more stuff happens than we can possibly include in our show, or perhaps a story bubbles up that doesn't have quite enough substance for a full segment, so we've collected a bunch of stories for a series of lightning round discussions. Why don't you get us started, Will?
Yeah, our first news topic today comes out of Texas A&M University. This is a historical violin study that shows that Antonio Stradivarius and Giuseppe Guarneri treated their instruments with various chemicals that produce the unique sounds of these violins. Several of these chemicals have been identified for the first time now. Borax and metal sulfites for fungal suppression, table salt for moisture control, alum for molecular cross-linking, and potash, or quicklime, for alkaline treatment. What do you guys make of this? Have you heard various legends about what makes the Stradivarius, these Italian old instruments sound so great? Because I've heard a number of things, and none of it had to do with borax.
Well, and I think we've discussed those legends on our segment about, 3D printed violins.
Right.
I know we've discussed this on at least one other occasion.
Yeah, I mean, my understanding had all been that it has to do with the wood, the trees that they were using had grown up during the Little Ice Age in Middle Ages Italy, and so therefore the trees grew slower, and therefore the rings were denser, and the wood was denser, and it's the density of the wood that has to do with it. But you hear all sorts of things about the varnish, I don't know. And now we hear about borax.
This is not out of left field for me to suppose that there might be something special in the materials they use. The real question is, did they know what materials they were using and how they affected their outcomes? I'm sure that back then they were not exactly aware of metal sulfates for fungal suppression, but it stands to reason that, through the trial and error processes of hundreds and hundreds of violins, that they would have figured out different combinations of different substances that would have yielded good results.
This is something that's always confused me about these instruments, and also because technology is so good. I mean, spectroscopy could probably do all this stuff where they can identify what's in varnishes. Why? I mean, to me, first of all, it's like, is this really the first time we're figuring out the composition of these varnishes? Like, what new thing happened where we can actually identify these chemicals or elements of the varnish? And two, why can't we? So why can't we make instruments like Strads and Guarneris anymore, right? So that might be what Willow's alluding to with the wood. But seeing as we're headed straight for another ice age, maybe we have a chance to come back to that illustrious way of making violins again.
All right, always finding the silver lining, Kensho.
Of course. Let's
move on to our next topic.
So this one is surprising given where this news is coming from, and we can get more into that. But first, San Francisco Symphony choral director Ragnar Bolin has resigned because of the vaccine mandate policies instituted by both the company and the city of San Francisco. Bolin had been the choral director for about 14 years and has expressed outspoken opposition to COVID vaccines on his Facebook page all over the course of this pandemic. And he wrote, "I have, with a growing sense of alarm, observed the tide turn in this direction in regards to medical passports. I am sad to now see the San Francisco Symphony comply with these diktats and to deprive their employees their basic rights to privacy, bodily autonomy, and informed consent."
Yeah, I was as surprised as you to see this. I mean, my gosh, that a choral director of all people, for one thing, would be an anti-vaxxer after we know that choral singing was the culprit for a few large-scale transmission events early in the pandemic, both north of where I live in Seattle and in the Netherlands, that led to the deaths of choral singers. I mean, that's number one with a bullet, why this is weird. But also, San Francisco? Also a Swedish choral director who lives in San Francisco? I mean, you would think that this person would be all for, social cohesion and the greater good and stuff like that, but just never know.
I think it's worth maybe drawing a line a thin one maybe, but a meaningful one to me, between people who are traditionally what we would call anti-vaxxers and people who are hesitant to get the COVID-19 vaccine. Most of the people who can reasonably make an argument against vaccine mandates for COVID-19 come at it from this, they're relatively new, they were developed very quickly, they, well, up until last month anyway, had not received full approval by all of the necessary arms. And by the way, this news came out, I think, slightly before FDA approval dropped.
That's right.
Anyway. And what I'll think of traditional anti-vaxxers are like, vaccines give my kids autism, which I don't think most people are saying. Certainly this underlying strain of like my body, my choice kind of attitude towards vaccines is the underlying commonality between the two camps. But I do think that there's a way of talking about it rationally that doesn't necessarily involve like having to descend into arguments about autism.
I do too, but I also think that there's another through line, which is misinformation and using misinformation to prey on people for their own gain, whatever that might be. Whether they just like to stir up chaos or whether they are trying to sell something, which we've seen all sorts of kind of quack.
Ivermectin.
Yeah, ivermectin and stuff like that. So,
but do you let's take Ragnar. Like, do you consider him a agent or a victim of that misinformation campaign?
Both. It's just from what I've read, it would seem both. The fact that he is promulgating this on his Facebook page, and it seems like he's been posting about this. I can't say I've seen all of his Facebook posts, but from what the posts that we are seeing referenced here, it's possible to be both a victim and a promulgator of it.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it's a vicious cycle.
And just what he points to is basically, I think he's going along the lines of bodily autonomy, what Tiff was just referring to as like my body, my choice, kind of informed consent, medical passports, government's going to watch over us kind of line of questioning in terms of why he doesn't want to get vaccinated or he doesn't believe in the vaccine mandate rather than just the science behind it.
Right, and that's of course the problem, is that that's like not how vaccines work. Like you've got to get everybody on board with it.
Well, that's where the my body, my choice thing just falls apart, because it's your choice, but you're also killing other people. So
right,
it's,
exactly.
You're affecting others.
But if we're looking for a silver lining, there is this kind of subsidiary news story, which is a much nicer story about Ivan Fischer, the great Hungarian conductor, who got his vaccine booster while on stage conducting a concert. So you love to see it.
Do you know what he was conducting?
No,
I really like. I want to. What would be the best piece to be conducting while getting a vaccine? Mahler's Resurrection. We'll talk about that later.
Yeah,
in this segment. All right. Well, on to our next story, and this truly does fall, in my view, under the category of but not enough to talk about for a whole segment.
Yeah.
On September 4th, German media reported that Eva Wagner-Pasquier, age 76, former joint director of the Bayreuth Festival, was pulled, quote, lifeless out of the Isar River. A former artistic advisor at Covent Garden and the Bastille Opera, Wagner-Pasquier shared the leadership of Bayreuth with her half-sister Katharina from 2008 to 2015. She has been resuscitated but is now comatose in the hospital, and I don't think there's been any further updates along those lines, but sometimes we descend into tabloid news. What do you guys, any reactions?
Just interesting to think that, so she's Richard Wagner's great granddaughter, I believe, and that also makes her Franz Liszt's great-great-great-granddaughter.
True.
Yeah, I mean, who knows? I wish the best for the family. I can only imagine what happened here. No matter what, it's a very bad thing. Yeah, I mean, we'll just have to follow this story because it is just the barest sketch of an outline of the facts that we know right now. That's right. But it's certainly strange.
Yeah, if we have any listeners based in Germany, be interested in hearing any updates on that. Well, that's that for that topic. Let's move on to our next story. Will.
Yeah, okay, so this is another one out of San Francisco, a much more delightful story than the previous one that we talked about. This is reported in the San Francisco Chronicle, and it's a story that took place on September 5th at the San Francisco Opera. After a performance of Tosca, the piece got a final joyous plot twist, a surprise marriage proposal. The entire cast had assembled for the curtain call for the last of the company's 5-performance run when bass Solomon Howard strode to the front of the stage and gestured to the audience to hold their applause. Then, as the hall fell silent, he stood before soprano Eileen Perez, who had just given a superb performance in the title role. "In front of God, in front of my sisters and cousins, and most importantly, in front of your mom and dad," he said, "I ask you, will you marry me?" Perez's reply was lost amid a torrent of applause, but her body language and the enthusiasm with which she leapt into Howard's arms right afterward left little doubt.
Aww.
Boy, that takes some cojones to do. I mean, that puts the Jumbotron proposal in a whole new light. Would you guys do this? I mean, that's really quite something.
Imagine getting through a performance knowing that that's what you were going to do at the end. It's part heroic and part are you daft? Isn't the standard conventional wisdom about public proposals now do not propose until you know that you're, is going to say yes? You have to have every single piece. It's just way risky, right? Is that not the most public thing that you could do?
Well, apparently he had asked her parents' permission. He had done the old-fashioned thing.
But that's what annoys me about this story the most. And especially for that line to be in the actual proposal for most importantly in front of your parents. Excuse me.
Most importantly, I'm going to ask you. I think is probably the most important thing. But I'm assuming that Eileen was Tosca. So was he Scarpia? So is this a
That's
Scarpia
awesome.
Tosca weird plot twist here?
That's awesome. All right. And next.
This one comes out of Berlin. The Berlin Philharmonic has reported that they will share ticket revenues from its September 19th family concert with the United Nations Refugee Agency. Kirill Petenko will present the concert to the audience before conducting Stravinsky's Firebird Suite. The illustrator Reinhard Kleist will draw images along with the music as the concert proceeds, and the resulting art will be put up for auction. My initial reaction to this, guys, why don't we see more of this kind of benefit for other agencies or nonprofits, let's say, in this country? When we do benefits, it's to just make sure that the institution itself stays afloat and not to help others.
Yeah, maybe the reason in this country is because we have so little government funding.
Yeah.
So there's less leeway to raise funds for other worthy charities and organizations.
Thank you for slamming home that alley-oop there, Will. Thank you.
The other thing I'll just mention about this is I've been to a concert before. Actually, a mutual friend of ours put on a concert with his orchestra where there was an artist painting live.
I've always wanted to do that.
I was skeptical going into it, but I just found it really entertaining. And you could watch her painting a little bit, and then you could go back to watching the orchestra. She was painting a scene from an Arabian Nights, and the piece that they were playing was Scheherazade. And then at the end, they put up the painting for auction, and it just seems like a win-win all around. So it's a fun concert concept that I would encourage people to explore.
Well, to wrap up our news roundup for this segment, we'll return to our favorite recurrent topic on the GabFest. The Met Orchestra is back. On Labor Day weekend, Mahler's Resurrection Symphony brought the full company and its audience back together in grand style. 90 minutes, an orchestra of 116, a chorus of 100, and 2,500 people attending in Damrosch Park. Worth noting, and I hadn't realized this before reading the New York Times report on the performance, the company has opened its season with Mahler's Symphony No. 2, The Resurrection, once before. In 1980, a bitter labor battle kept the Met closed for 2 months into the fall, which now seems hilarious. But anyway, 2 months of a late start, and then Mahler's Resurrection Symphony was their, quote, paean to cohesion, their great return. Now, of course, they're returning after more than 18 months of unpaid furlough due to the ravages of COVID-19. Can we, oh please, put to bed the recurrence of the Mets? I don't know, we probably can't and we probably shouldn't. But the story of the Mets' recurring abuses, frankly, of its orchestra in not negotiating with them and not being able to work out a COVID current model, but instead just sort of waiting until everything was back to quote unquote normal and just coming back in grand fashion only in the circumstances in which they could be certain of garnering a profit.
Yeah, it's hard to put it to bed because it is such a leading institution in this country. I mean, it's far and away the largest opera company in the United States. And of course, that makes it one of the largest in the world. On this podcast, we try not to just cover the elite rung of the world of classical music. We try to look down into the world of school ensembles and education and bands and choirs and the whole thing. But it would be kind of a dereliction of duty, I think, to look away from the major problems of such a large institution. It's good to see it back, but I don't know. I just wonder, I wonder what the mood was. I wonder if it was totally triumphant, or, there's got to be some lingering bad vibes in there. Kensho, you tend to have insight into what's going on at the Met. What would you think about that?
I don't know. I think that from what I've read on social media, various people in the orchestra, it seemed like they were happy to be back at work. But it was interesting. The messaging was very much more toward great to be performing for our audience rather than it's great to be back at work for the Met, let's say. And then, not to mention, they're working hard already. This was last week, and then just this weekend they did a performance, a broadcast, right, public broadcast of Verdi's Requiem in the Met with a full audience. So they're certainly starting off big.
I assume that that contract, whatever they're on now, is not what we had been talking about. I guess this is about a year ago now, where it's the proposed 30% cut in return for going back to work at that point.
I think they took a cut, though. I think it was something 20% maybe.
I'm sure they did.
Yeah.
Well, TBD as always, but we're happy to see them back, I think. All right. That wraps up our news roundup for this week. And let's go to Will for our second segment.
In celebration of its 130th anniversary this year, Carnegie Hall has released a new branding campaign, including a logo and monogram. Created by the New York branding firm Champion Designs, the logo, really a word mark, features the name Carnegie Hall in white letters against a bright red background, basically the color of the Chinese flag is how I think of it. The letters have a distinctive character and shape and are tied to the hall's history. Here's what the designers say. Quote, in 1919, Carnegie Hall's architect, William Burnett Tuthill, engineered the iconic facade that makes the hall what it is today, including the large poster cases surrounding the building's perimeter, featuring electrically lit stained glass canopies. The hall's most recognizable asset is its name. A word mark, this word mark, was the only logo solution that made sense. Unquote. In addition to the word mark logo, there is also a separate monogram, basically a social media circle with CH in the center. But this uses an entirely different font taken from a different historical source. I'm sure we'll get into that in a second, but let's start off with the logo itself. What do we think?
I think it's boring. This is not the first time that we've discussed typography on
That's right.
on the podcast. Our last segment was about the San Francisco Symphony's rebranding, which has it came out with a bunch of kind of virtual dynamic versions of it that you could play with in a little game and so on. But the upshot of it is that it varies the height of the typeface, what in essence is a very clean typeface with a serif on it, and it varies it in such a way as to evoke a crescendo or kind of a musical shape. In this case, if you ask me what the Carnegie Hall logo looks like, I'd be like, it says Carnegie Hall and it's red.
Right.
I have nothing to say about the selection of the typeface. I don't think, for me, it evokes any sense of history or any sense of what I associate viscerally with Carnegie. It looks fine. I guess it would look fine on a mug.
Have you guys looked at the actual design of the stained glass poster windows that this is based off? Because I think that there is something to be said for mining an organization's history and sort of using that as the basis for an update. I like that idea. And I think that the stained glass designs of their poster windows are very attractive. One commenter that I saw said that they should have used the little lead piping, that connects the various fragments of the stained glass together as part of the design, and maybe to use the colors, it's this yellow and blue, that could have been interesting. But of course, that's less clean looking. The one thing I will say about the current design is that, if you're looking from far away at the standards, at the flags that fly outside of Carnegie Hall, it's very easy to see. It's high contrast, and it's big, and it's bold, and it just says Carnegie Hall. Like, you know what's going on.
But if we're going to talk about flag design, I mean, like, there is a sense of graphics that is integral to flag design, and it's not just typography. There was an opportunity here to have some sort of a border or a circle or let's be kind of trite and use a musical note, something, that has a visual, like all the immediate visual impact of a graphic rather than just the words. And I agree that the biggest asset to Carnegie Hall is its name, so fine, but there's no, a logo implies to me some sort of graphic design element that I feel is just missing here.
Kensho, what do you think? I mean, you were never a New Yorker, but you're a frequent visitor to New York. Do you recognize the window design that they're talking about? Like, when you heard that it was based on that, did that mean something to you? Do you think that that's iconic? And what do you think of this?
Honestly, I've walked by this place so many times, and I don't think I've ever actually physically noticed the stained glass Carnegie Hall lettering ever.
What do you think of it, though?
I think it's really nice, but obviously when you look at it, obviously in scale too with the posters, it's not very big. So it's It's not like it's, New York style, like in your face kind of advertising, which I think this logo is trying to do now with this kind of, red was always a color for Carnegie Hall, right? They always had it somewhere. So it's not like it's out of the blue. It's not a huge update, pun intended, I guess. And I can see like the way the art tails off. They're trying to make it, very similar to what it looks like in the stained glass. So it's fine. Can we just get to the monogram, please? Because this is where I just raged so hard.
Yeah. Okay. So let's talk about this. So this is like I said, it's like a social media circle. Once again, it's the same red background. The strange thing is that they have chosen a different font. So it's just CH, Carnegie Hall. And they've chosen a different font from a different historical source, which is they found some rusted old piece of Carnegie steel that was used to construct the hall that had an imprint that said Carnegie Hall. And they took the C and H from there. And it has a very, how would you describe it? Kind of like a Webdings not Comic Sans, but a very.
It's a curly Q serif.
Curly Q serif, a very childish, I would say, look to it. Yeah, what do you guys make of this?
It surprised me to know what the inspiration actually was, because at first I thought they might have been trying to evoke musical typography in the sense of like the C looks maybe a little bit like what a alto clef would, with the curled up and ball, the ball serif at the end of the C's. I terribly dislike how this has no correspondence whatsoever to the logo. And I don't like the slant. The C and the H both lean quite heavily to the left, and that for me,
the scaling is really weird. Like the C just seems like it just like is a part that's supposed to like lock into the H at some point, because it's just like not really. It's just outsized. And then I don't know what the obsession is. I know where this is coming from, Will, because you explained it so clearly. But why do we have to have like either like orchestras? I was doing like a little survey of like orchestra logos, and the amount of times I saw if the orchestra has an F or a P in their name, to use like the little curly Q of the forte marking, or use like the F hole, squiggly lines and stuff like that. Like, do we really need to?
But that's what I find surprising about this logo, is apparently that's not what they were going for, which
right.
like boggles my mind. Because that's what it looks like, and it looks like a bad attempt at that, right? For that matter.
Yeah, exactly.
The thing that I want to go back to is Tiffany's first point, which I think, is the cardinal sin here. Look, I never took Marketing 101, but I would have to think that, like, number one on the syllabus with a bullet has got to be, like, you maintain a consistency across your branding.
Yeah.
Like, you don't have two different properties, one for your, like, banners and then a different one for your social media bubbles. Like, do the same thing. And also, I have to say, like, I'm not opposed to boring branding for cultural institutions. Like, I think it's fine. It's like, it's a cultural institution. Like, make the interesting thing what you do with the institution. And yeah, I guess you want the brand to reflect it after a certain fashion, but like, just keep the branding the same for 100 years. It's fine. Do a little tweak to the font every 20 years or whatever.
Well, we're very, like, as a society, like, totally obsessed with the little nudges that design can apparently have on just people. And, like, I am an eye roller at the whole, like, obsession right now. Believe me, I am. But there is, like I was saying, kind of a visceral impact that something like that can help as an institution kind of have a lift off.
I think that they should sell this monogram design to the makers of the upcoming remake of Willy Wonka and the Chocolate Factory, because it would be perfect. It would be the perfect font for that property.
Okay, but actually that speaks to a point that I wanted to bring up. So there's a remake of Willy Wonka, whatever, to kind of, cater to a younger crowd that may not relate as well to the old one.
Right.
And when you read the press release for all of this through Carnegie Hall, it's all about how Carnegie Hall is now much more than just a performance hall, and they're doing all these things to make music more accessible. And there's like a specific line about how a young person might encounter Carnegie Hall and how they would be able to recognize the logo or whatever through Instagram. So don't you think this is what happened here, is basically saying, okay, well, we'll come up with our logo that's going to be on our static website that no one will ever go to. That's the age, under the age of 35. And we'll do something fun for our younger audiences that may like this curly-cued nonsense on IG. But as someone that uses Instagram, this is ridiculous. I don't like it. I've surveyed a bunch of people that are our age or younger, and they're kind of like, what is this? So did they hit the mark on the monogram? I'm not sure.
Okay, so like I'll just say my opinion about this, which is that I think that they should have used a little bit more of that stained glass design, or maybe like the design of the building itself. There's got to be something in the facade that they could have, I do love the idea of mining the history, or of mining the what already exists, and making, connecting the past to the present and the future. I think that's cool. Like, I prefer that, for example, to the San Francisco Symphony model of just throwing out their branding every 20 years and coming up with something new, or similar to what the New York Philharmonic does, honestly. Like, I think the New York Philharmonic is another train wreck of a logo, their current thing, with the the slash and whatever it is and the circle. But this ain't it. I mean, there's the devil is always in the details. You can mine history in a lot of different ways. Well, this has been a very interesting discussion of branding. I will tell you one thing I learned from my recent branding exercises. Everybody has an opinion about logo and graphic design, and everybody loves to weigh in on this. And the final thing that I'll leave us off with is just to say that to talk a little bit about our logo for the Classical Gabfest, because that was a group effort. Kensho and his now wife were particularly involved. They were watching me on Zoom as I micro-adjusted every tiny little thing. But if anybody's wondering, the lettering, those all come from 19th century scores, the kind of belle epoque of lettering and design. And, it just seemed like such an obvious way to evoke what we're all about, to then frame those in a kind of kooky, fun style. So hopefully people like the Classical Gabfest logo. Give us a shout out. Let us know what you think of that. And please let us know, because there's so many organizations out there. So listeners, be our eyes on the ground and send us examples of your favorite logos and design from the world of classical music. We'd love to take a look at them. And with that, we move on to our next topic, Kensho.
Listeners, take a moment to think about your favorite symphonic works from the British Isles. I'm sure most of you are thinking about Elgar, Vaughan Williams, or maybe even Walton. In 2020, a Twitter poll called the World Cup of 20th Century British and Irish Symphonies pitted over 400 symphonic works from the region against each other. While the aforementioned three composers did very well, to no surprise, a certain work by an often forgotten composer played the role of the Cinderella team in tournament brackets, Sir Malcolm Arnold's Fifth Symphony. Let's hear a clip. As a Malcolm Arnold neophyte myself, I was surprised by this result, and we at the GABFest wanted to get to know the composer and this piece more in depth. Luckily for us, our good friend Richard BRATBY of the Birmingham Post has written extensively about Sir Malcolm, including a recent article in Gramophone magazine in recognition of the 100th anniversary of the composer's birth. We are excited to be able to welcome Richard back to the GABFest this week, and our first three-peat guest. Welcome back, Richard. Thank you so much for joining us.
Great to be here. Thank you. Thanks for asking me. It's always good to talk Malcolm.
So, I've confessed that I have not encountered Malcolm Arnold so prevalently as maybe you wrote in your Gramophone article about how it shows up in youth orchestra repertoires and stuff like this. And this was not part of my musical upbringing at all. So maybe if you can let us know about what a typical youth orchestra or youth musician, where do they encounter Malcolm Arnold and why is he so widely loved?
You've heard that term, a musician's musician, a composer who writes so well for orchestra and for particular instruments that people just love playing it. It falls under the hand, it makes them sound good. Every time you're playing it, you feel that it's just zinging off the page. Now, usually it's quite a derogatory term, isn't it? It implies it's kind of, it's not really for the audience. It's sort of a bit drab, it's a bit technical. Malcolm Arnold had this gift. He could write musicians' music that people loved playing, that sounded good, that was playable, effective, absolutely spoke to an audience. An incredible melodic gift, incredible fertility, almost Mozart level ability for turning out a melody. And he could write it in a way that just sounded great on an orchestra. I mean, he's principally an orchestral composer. The most astonishing thing of all, I think, certainly for a post-war composer, which he very much was, he really emerged in the late 1940s, early 50s, was he writes melodies to die for, melodies that you get in your head, never leave you. And again, it frames it in this incredibly colourful, vivid orchestral writing that just sings off the page. So, you're conducting a youth symphony orchestra, a school wind band, brass band, possibly. You're looking for something modern to play. You're looking for something that sounds new, that sounds fresh, that sounds contemporary. And at the same time, you're looking for something that's going to be playable for your amateur or young players. And you want something that your audience is going to enjoy. Arnold gives you all of that. It just absolutely zings off the page. It's great. It feels great under the hands. Remarkable gift for melody, this kind of playful sense of humour, this incredible fertility. And what I've been trying to argue lately is that beyond that, it's kind of quite seriousness, which we're only really now perhaps starting to appreciate. I think, like a lot of composers who are very, very gifted melodically, who are very playable, who are very accessible, there's been a tendency not to take him totally seriously. Certainly he felt his career suffered because of that. But the reality is, the music is still there. People are still playing it. And I think, certainly in the UK, if you're playing a classical instrument, in any kind of ensemble at all, it'd be incredible if you got to the age of 18 and then never encountered or played or heard something by Malcolm Arnold.
Yeah, that gets into an interesting question here. The ironic position of a composer who is both widely loved and yet somehow obscure or underappreciated. How does that come about in general and in the case of Malcolm Arnold in particular?
Well, there's various reasons, aren't there? There's kind of, a composer gets famous for one particular thing and no one really wants to hear the other things he does. And, we can all think, this sounds ridiculous now, but back in the 30s, people used to get very upset about the fact that Sibelius's Valse Triste was really popular, or the Karelia Suite, and they, would have to plead for him, to be taken seriously as a symphonist. I guess perhaps a US equivalent might be, I don't know if this is valid or not, perhaps Leonard Bernstein, phenomenon Broadway, also writing these complex, tortured, incredibly ambitious symphonic works, speak to the troubles and complexities of the era in a way that perhaps people didn't, they wanted to think to use good old Lenny banging out the show tunes, West Side Story, Candide, and they didn't really want to sort of deal with what he was saying perhaps in Kaddish or The Age of Anxiety. And Malcolm Arnold, I think, was a bit like that, except, there's another dimension to his reputation as well. What do we think about classical composers who write film scores? He wrote well over 100 film scores, mostly for the British film industry, all of which just sound like Arnold, sound very much like him. These films come on, these black and white films come on late at night, and you just hear the first chords zinging across the title sequence. It has that freshness, that immediacy that is absolutely recognisable. But as we all know, post-war composers are meant to be tortured, they're meant to be angsty, they are meant to be wrestling for years, crafting a 4-minute piece for 12 players, which needs an academic, which needs algebra to explain how it all fits together. Arnold was I mean, I think in the space of 1 year, he wrote, I think, the symphony, a couple of concertos, and 11 film scores, I think, in about 1953. And he kept this rate up throughout the 1950s. So, you know, this instantly popular, instantly accessible, incredibly fluent, incredibly proficient worker. And, you know, can you take that seriously as an artist? How can you be an artist if you can write to order, appealing to cinema audiences as well as concert goers? You know, it's that snobbery that exists about film music. I think did a lot to damage Arnold's reputation. I mean, also the case of his personal life, his extremely complex and difficult personal life, didn't do him any favors either. But that's another story, and one that I think we should be trying to move away from now, perhaps. So it's an astonishing and harrowing tale.
You know, the way that you describe his music, you're talking about this freshness, this is like kind of the freshness of his melodies and the way they jump off the page and that they fit in the hand. Those are all descriptions that I associate in my youth orchestra upbringing with like Mendelssohn or Dvorak. It seems like Arnold's popularity in that dimension of like kind of youth orchestra training, like bread and butter youth orchestra repertoire, is somewhat geographically bound. And so I wonder if you could give our listeners, who I think are largely based in the US, like what are the works that we ought to start with if somebody is just like wanting to know what that fresh-faced immediacy of his music is all about?
Well, it's interesting you mentioned Mendelssohn and Dvorak. I mean, Arnold was a trumpeter himself, but like Mendelssohn and Dvorak, he's a phenomenally gifted instrumentalist who had played in ensembles and knew how to make things, how textures worked, how technical aspects worked. And he had that ability to sort of really make it, I say, zing off the page, to lie under the hands. But I mean, yeah, there's these various facets of his music. I mean, his film scores are classics, certainly of British cinema, and I would argue world cinema. I think the films of David Lean are pretty well established as a major presence in international cinema. Arnold worked with him for quite a lot of his major films, including, I say, The Bridge on the River Kwai, for which he won an Academy Award in 1957. So there's those film scores, all very characteristic. There's no sense of compromise in any of them. He was very adaptable. He could turn on a pop style, jazz style, as he saw it. All, you know, he could do melodrama, he could do comedy, he could do parody school songs. You know, you name it. He could just, but it still sounds very like Arnold. Yes, and luckily a lot of these have been recorded in concert suites and so on the Chandos label. But then there's this sort of lighter side to him. I say the side that I mentioned that people in the UK love in their youth orchestras, in their sort of community orchestras, and that his ability to craft a melody and to craft a miniature, again, like Mendelssohn and Dvorak, you know, he could find a great tune and just a perfect setting for it, a perfect harmonic color, the perfect instrumental color, time it to perfection. And I think that the absolute center of that, there's several suites of what he wrote 2 suites of pieces he called English dances in the early 1950s. 4 pieces in each suite, none of them more than 3 minutes long, each one of which takes a single fantastic, often very memorable melody, very catchy, and just absolutely gets it perfectly scored. It's piquant, it's tangy, it's witty. There's usually humour in there. You follow these up with a set of Scottish dances, a set of Cornish dances, a set of Irish dances, all of which have the same kind of energy. I mean, the Scottish dances are just terrific. You know, there's 8 minutes of music, 4 little pieces. In the course of that, you've got a crazy bassoon cadenza emulating a drunken Glaswegian. You've got bagpipes, you've got skulls, you've got this glorious third dance, which is just a soaring melody for flute and strings, which, you know, you're out there in the Hebrides looking at the blue skies. It should be a folk song. The incredible thing is all of these pieces, you know, they certainly have the character of the sort of regions and nationalities and the cultures he describes, of English to Scottish to Welshness, whatever. But he never used folk songs for these pieces. They're completely original melodies. He seems to have this ability to pull it out the air. And then, of course, you have what you call, you know, I don't like the term serious music, but clearly he was a man with large-scale ambitions. He wrote a sequence of 9 symphonies spanning his entire life. I mean, I would argue he's sort of the, I mean, I'm not the first person to say this. This is not an original observation. He's been called sort of English Shostakovich. He was a man with a very powerful social conscience. You know, he was a socialist. He was a campaign for various political causes. His own life took a turn for the worse. He suffered from mental illness, depression, alcoholism, And basically his symphonies sort of take you on this sort of journey from sort of the optimism of Britain in the post-war era, this sort of bright, sunlit, brassy, confident world of the period of the coronation, immediately after the Second World War, when they were rebuilding and everything felt optimistic, through to the 1980s, when his own sort of total sort of mental and psychological collapse and this devastating, strange, numb Ninth Symphony. And
where does 5 fall, as long as we're talking about this tournament of symphonies?
I think the feeling is this is the one where it all comes together. If you're going to choose any of the 9 Arnold symphonies, and I think they're all worth hearing, this is the one where it all crystallizes. You have Arnold the melodist, this man who could just come out with a tune that you'll never forget. If you listen to the slow movement, I mean, he knew the critics were going to rip him to pieces because it's just a tune. It's just a great romantic tune. Throughout the symphony, essentially he is sort of dealing, as any great composer does, any great post-romantic composer does, with the issues that preoccupied him. He'd gone through a tragic period in his life. I think the deaths of like 3 or 4 of his close friends and relations are kind of commemorated with sort of motifs or incidents within the course of the symphony. I mean, you don't have to know that, but you can feel this sadness, this anger, this kind of rage against the world that is conspiring against him. And then at the end of it, this galloping towards triumph, towards a great conclusion, the cymbals clash, this glorious melody, which he knew the critics would laugh at him for, and they did laugh at him for, kind of sweeps in, and then he just pulls the rug out from under her feet. The whole thing just collapses in ashes and ruins at the end. We've got this sort of broken, lonely man. It's both a portrait of its time, it's a portrait of his ambitions as a composer, as a symphonist. It's like a Mahler or Shostakovich symphony. It's a tremendous emotional ride.
To that point, do you see Arnold's music as being quintessentially British, as we see other of his colleagues? Or is there something else there?
Well, I would, wouldn't I, being British? I would like to think there's more to it than that. I mean, it's definitely a particular Britishness in its makeup. It's a kind of, it's not a Britishness you often hear in music, though, a kind of Britishness. It's a kind of irreverent, slightly grungy, slightly lower down the social scale. You hear some of his melodies, you think that sounds like something someone is bashing out in a pub on an old piano for people to sing along to. And I mean, that is probably how it started, knowing Malcolm Arnold. He was that kind of guy. So is this kind of, he loved the kind of the culture that was regarded as vulgar, music hall, cinema. He loved pop music. He was a huge fan of the Chieftains, the Irish band. He also worked with Deep Purple, the prog rock band in the 1960s, on their concerto for band and orchestra. So he was it's a kind of Britishness. There's certainly elements of that sort of, that sort of Elgar style sort of grandeur, the sort of ability for melody, the sense of pomp and ceremony and spectacle and pageantry, which are all kind of elements of perhaps how Britain sees itself. But it's through a very distinctive sensibility. And I mean, I hope and would like to think that sort of a non-British listener coming to this music would still get something from it. I think it was an emotional truth. Certainly, I spoke to Sakari Orimo, this Finnish conductor who conducted the Fifth Symphony this summer, and he said, well, no, I hadn't heard of Arnold, but I had a friend in Helsinki who had heard of him. He just played me a recording of Arnold's double violin concerto, and I just immediately thought, this is just terrific music. This is just music that speaks to me, and he wanted to explore further, and he did. And I hope anyone would have that experience. And I say it's Britishness, but perhaps not the Britishness that the tourist board wants you to see. It's not Beefeaters, and it's not the Tower of London. There's a certain amount of that, but it's kind of that as seen on a brightly coloured postcard or in a cartoon, or someone having a laugh about it in a pub.
The piece that I wanted to bring up is Malcolm Arnold's first quintet for brass, the first brass quintet, because I would say that on this side of the Atlantic, at least in my experience, that has got to be one of his most popular pieces. I mean, we all met at a summer music festival, and there were brass quintets playing that piece on chamber concerts every single summer that I was there, at least. You mentioned in your article that his chamber music is particularly underappreciated, and you also point out, and this is something that you guys talked about on the beloved but sadly gone Classical Top 5 podcast, is the fact that he wrote music for basically every solo instrument, every instrument to play just as a, without accompaniment. Can you talk about some of the chamber music and the solo pieces in particular?
I mentioned, I think he wrote a series of fantasies for unaccompanied, pretty much all the unaccompanied brass and wind instruments, which just each of them is like a brilliant little, it's like a sketch. It's like he's just sort of pulled out a pad, with a just sort of brilliant caricature with a single line, a caricature or portrait of the instrument. And I think, as Tiffany was saying, this idea, she mentioned Mendelssohn and Dvorak, this idea that this craftsmanship. I mean, he was a brass player himself. He's a superb trumpeter by all accounts. He was, I think, the youngest ever principal trumpet player in the London Philharmonic Orchestra before he went to become a full-time composer. So naturally, brass is a big thing for him, and he really understands brass. I think brass players really get that and really love it. And when he sort of combine it with his melodic gift, his wit, and that sort of deep and sometimes quite dark emotional undercurrent that's in his music. I mean, that first quintet he wrote is, absolute standard. I mean, it's just supposed to be one of the best, most well-crafted, most entertaining, and simultaneously most well-written, most playable brass quintets in the repertoire.
You mentioned earlier in our conversation that you wanted to get away from the narrative of Arnold's life as a way of explaining his works. And I wonder if you could put that statement into context, because you've made such an eloquent argument for all of the kind of international or like objective appeal of his work, his tunefulness, the way that he can transcend what I described as kind of a geographical bound earlier. But what is the baggage that comes with his life that we ought to skirt or maybe take with a grain of salt?
Well, it's tricky. I mean, he only died in 2006, and when he died, he hadn't really been effective as a composer for about 20 years. He came from a family which clearly had a history of mental illness of various sorts. He had a brother who committed suicide, another brother was killed in the war. These things affected him profoundly, and then, astonishingly, it seems almost like I've said Mozart level, this kind of sense of a musical gift that seemed to be almost something he couldn't suppress. He'd have these sort of bursts of almost manic energy where it seemed like he could just turn out perfect, inspired, colourful scores, one after the other, non-stop, working through the night, weeks on end. Then he would just collapse. And like a lot of people under pressure, not the first, he turned to drink. There were other issues, emotional issues involved. He was a difficult man. He was sort of known as this great character, this larger-than-life clown almost on the British musical scene. This sort of guy who, he called the Royal Philharmonic Orchestra a bunch of "see you next Tuesdays" when they refused to take expletive deleted, because when they were working with rock back with Deep Purple and they weren't taking it seriously. He just absolutely swore at them. He would do these things. He'd get blindingly drunk, climb on top of pianos, dance around, drop his trousers. He was known for this, and it's like, oh, what this kind of sense of what a great lad, what a great bloke. And yet, what was going on was this man was falling apart on the inside, absolutely disintegrating. What bothers me, what upsets me, is that this happened in our lifetime. We talk about Schumann, Hugo Wolf, the great sort of cases in the 19th century of these great artists, these tremendous creative gifts who were just destroyed almost by social and pressures and by their own psychological and mental problems. And this happened on our watch. This happened to Malcolm Arnold. He got worse and worse, spiraled into depression, estranged from his family, spent all his money basically buying people drinks. He'd give money, he'd give out sheafs of £50 notes on Belsize Park High Street in London to complete strangers when he just had his film score royalties in. There was a darker side to it. He was assaulted, by members of his family. He also was abusive to them in turn. It was an ugly story. And basically, by the late 1970s, his own family had sort of had him restrained by a court order. He's confined to a mental hospital in Northampton, which is the town where he was born. And what we know now is they subject him to a form of electroconvulsive therapy, which basically means, as I understand it, putting electric shock through the frontal lobes of your brain. This was considered suitable therapy at this point for personality disorders. When he came out of it, he was effectively penniless. He was sort of practically a vagrant at one point and was sort of rescued from that by a chap who sort of took him in and just acted as his kind of minder and carer. But what is very clear is that what was left of his creativity, what was left of his musical gift, was absolutely destroyed by this medical treatment he is subject to. His mind, his a part of his personality and of his creative ability was absolutely scoured out and destroyed. It seems to me absolutely. I mean, this happened in about the early 1980s. I mean, I was around then. I was playing his music not long after that, unaware, all of us unaware that this was going on, really, unless you were close to him in his circle. It wasn't the kind of thing people talked about in public. What we can do now is celebrate the music, listen to music, and really get something from it. I mean, he said that. I mean, it's quoted quite often. He said it in various different ways of phrasing it, but one of the things he said when he was lucid was, "All music is an act of friendship. It's an act of communication between people." And I think that's really what he's trying to do here. I think his music really does speak from him to. It feels like a gift. It's like he gave us far more than he ever got back for it, really, and in his life. And I'm glad he's getting his due at this point.
Well, I'm going to speak for myself, but maybe for my colleagues as well, that you've opened up a gift box of all this music that I don't think I really knew about. Maybe I've heard it in passing, but it just gets me really excited to discover this. And I hope listeners, you take the time to at least listen to the Fifth Symphony, if not all 9 symphonies and much more. Richard, thank you so much for joining us. Would you be willing to stick around and recommend something to our listeners for our classical mixtape segment?
Absolutely, it'd be a pleasure.
In our classical mixtape, we each recommend some music that's caught our ear this week to share with our listeners. So, Richard, what do you have for us this week?
Well, it's got to be Sir Malcolm, hasn't it? After what we've been talking
surprise,
about,
surprise.
it
Doesn't
take me much. Take much to get me back to his music and to sort of put it on. And the one I was just thinking, you guys, you possibly don't know symphonic repertoire. Clearly, you've listened to his Fifth, but I think if I was going to say to someone who, assuming you could find your own way fairly easily to the popular Malcolm Arnold, the film scores, the light music, the tuneful miniatures, that they're pretty much out there to be grabbed very easily. If I was trying to introduce someone into the other side, the great symphonist, the kind of man speaking for his time and for his generation in the most accessible way, I think I would say enter the symphony cycle with the first movement of his Second Symphony, a glorious performance by the London Symphony Orchestra, Richard Hickox on Chandos records, beautifully played. And this is Arnold, I think, at his freshest, at his most accessible, just at his most natural. I'd say it's the first movement of a symphony. I recommend listening to the entire symphony because it's a terrific ride. It just opens with this sort of serene melody. And I always feel when I hear it, it's sunlight spreading across a landscape of sort of the rays of the sun catching the colours, catching it as the whole thing gradually lights up and sort of becomes real, becomes vivid. So it's a glorious melody. It's also a very sophisticated piece of symphonic architecture and the first movement of an incredibly life-affirming almost I wouldn't say unclouded by any means, nothing my Arnold ever is, but a very very rewarding symphony, very enjoyable, accessible symphony, which I think if you wanted to sort of move with the greatest of ease and with the greatest of enjoyment into this astonishing sort of post-war symphonic world that Arnold opens up, that would be, I think, a wonderful place to start.
Great recommendation, Richard, and thanks so much for being on the show. Let's go to Will next for our next recommendation.
All right, so my recommendation this week comes from a personal story about Carnegie Hall. I've performed there twice, once on a college choir tour, and then once again when I was conducting the Cincinnati Symphony Youth Orchestra. And the program that I took on the road with the youth orchestra has got to be one of the strangest youth orchestra programs that's ever played in Carnegie Hall, I think. It was one of my pieces. It was my third symphonic essay, a kind of hausgemacht suite from the Prokofiev Romeo and Juliet, where I just took various movements that I liked, and then 2 pieces by Alfred Schnittke, of course. And the piece that we opened the program with was a movement from one of Schnittke's film scores called The Story of an Unknown Actor. It's been arranged into a fantastic suite. And the first movement of this piece is one of my all-time favorite pieces of music. It is just this incredible, I mean, truly awesome theme and variations. It is so epic, so much fun. He does everything that you can do. It's just so badass. Anyway, I have to recommend that because that's an immediate memory that comes to mind when I think of Carnegie Hall.
So you trolled Carnegie Hall and your kids.
Yeah, a lot of the kids were I don't know. We had played Tchaikovsky's Fourth Symphony earlier in the year, and a lot of them really wanted to do that.
And
I was like,
absolutely.
It was the end of my
everyone.
contract. I was going into unemployment. I was like, F this. I'm doing what I want to. And it was like, you're a youth orchestra. You're going to New York. Like, everybody would play Tchaikovsky Fourth Symphony. We got to play something dope that nobody else does.
Yeah, you basically listened to Jeremy, the whole youth orchestra there. Okay.
Yep. Anyway, it was great for me.
That's what counts. Thanks, Will. Great recommendation. Let's go to Kensho next.
Well, I am picking something that has nothing to do with our segments this week, so go me. I just had this kind of pop into my head this week, remembering a certain encore that violinist Chris and Leong played when we worked together on Korngold Violin Concerto up in Montreal. This is a violin arrangement of a guitar piece by Francisco Tárrega called Recuerdos de la Alhambra, and it's quite a well-known piece, but arranged for violin by, I think, Ricci. This is a pretty amazing feat, I think, for a violinist, so have a listen.
I saw James Ennis do this as an encore once, and I did not know at all what it was. I'm very happy now to know what the name of the piece was, because it is stunning. Like if you can get somebody to do all those ricochets like with that perfect clarity, because that's what it sounds like spiccato. It's all ricochet. All of it is ricochet.
It's amazing amount of bow control, and I have to say we did 5 performances, and maybe I wished he would do different encores, but at the same time, hearing this 5 times, I mean, every single night the hall was so incredibly
Dead
quiet
silent,
during the encore. It's just a spellbinding one. So I mean, this is a great encore, I think, after a concerto. This is great.
Thanks so much, Kensho. For my recommendation this week, I took a deep dive into the World Cup of 20th Century British and Irish Symphonies. And it has since been refashioned after the original tournament that we discussed. It is now going by the World Cup of British/Irish String Concertant Works.
It doesn't have quite the same ring to it, if I'm being honest.
Okay.
But it is a kind of nicely run poll posting various string concertante works and then pitting them against each other in a Twitter poll. So a work that I came across in my rudimentary clicking around of the current incarnation of this Twitter thread is Dobrinka Tabakova's Suite in Old Style. This is performed by Maxim Risanov and the Spanish Radio Television Symphony Orchestra. You'll find the links to all these and to our full classical mixtape playlist in the show notes.
And with that, it's time to wrap up this episode of the Classical Gabfest. I'm William White, and on behalf of Tiffany Liu and Kensho Watanabe, I'd like to thank you so much for listening and to encourage you to subscribe and rate us on your podcast app. We'd also love your help spreading the word about the show on social media, where you can find us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. You can reach us at classicalgabfest@gmail.com, and we'd love to hear from you. Until next time, happy listening, and we'll be with you next week.